What is this, the Cullen Tucker family in the front row?
Oh, yeah.
That's our voice.
There's an age limit. You cannot attend this conference if you're over 40. Some people don't know this, apparently.
We've got some more people trickling in, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I would like to welcome you to the Wilson Center. I'm Bob Hathaway. I direct the Asia program here, and it's my great pleasure to turn things over to the experts whom you came to see. I want to simply acknowledge the fact that we have two people who have come all the way from Taiwan to be with us this afternoon, a third who has just returned from Taiwan. So we're deeply grateful for all of our speakers who have inconvenienced themselves in order to be with us today. Gong Lin, who is program associate here in the Asia program at the Wilson Center, is the person who has organized this event. He'll moderate today. So I want to say welcome to all of you and turn things over to Gong.
Thank you, Bob. Welcome to the Wuzhou Wilson Center. And today we are very pleased to have a great event on Taiwan. We know that Taiwan now has become a very hot issue in towns and so many meetings that today we intentionally invite the speakers from Taiwan and with slightly different perspective, and also added by another two speakers here in the United States. Let me give a brief introduction of our four speakers for today's seminar. And our first speaker, and alphabetically, will be Professor Stephen Goldstein, who is Sophia Smith Professor of Government at the Smith College and the Director of the Taiwan Studies Workshop at Harvard University. His current research focuses on relations between mainland China and Taiwan, as well as the evolution of U.S.-Taiwan relations. He has written, co-authored, or edited 9 books, as well as many scholarly articles and book reviews. Professor Goldstein holds a PhD from Columbia University. Our second speaker will be Professor Wen-Lang, who is the director of the University Center for Chinese Studies, Tunghai University, Taichung, and an advisor to the Premier of the Republic of China, Taiwan. He has been a professor emeritus at the Ohio State University since 1996 and was a member of the ROC Legislative Yuan from 1996 to the year 2000. Professor Li has published 8 books and numerous articles and book reviews. He holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Our third speaker, will be Professor Byron Wang, who is a professor of public policy and administration, National Zhejiang University, and an advisor to the ROC president. Previously, he was a professor and a chairman of the Department of Government and Public Administration, Chinese University of Hong Kong. He has authored or edited 7 books and published numerous articles and book chapters. Professor Wang holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And I would like to point out Professor Wen-Lang and Professor Byron Wang both come from Taiwan with different colors. I'm not at a position to tell their color, but I will promise you their remarks will be colorful. And after the 3 speakers, and I will ask Dr. Michael Pillsbury to serve as a discussion. Dr. Pillsbury has served in a variety of positions in the legislative and executive branches of the United States. He is a counselor of the Atlantic Council of the United States and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He is the author of, among others, Chinese View of Future Warfare. Dr. Pillsbury holds a PhD from Columbia University. He has just returned from Taiwan and will travel to the island again to observe the elections. I would like to add one word that Dr. Pillsbury's remarks today will be pursued at the capacity of private citizen. Is what you mean?
Unemployed.
Private citizen. That's what. Not.
不代表任何一个单位。
Okay, thank you. So I will ask each speakers to talk about 15 minutes, but no more than 20 minutes, and ask Dr. Pillsbury to give comments for about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Is it okay for you? Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's start with Dr. Goldstein, please.
Guess I should begin by saying that there's no significance whatsoever to my red shirt. While we're into colors.
It looks very purple from over here.
Really? What I'd like to do is to try to build a talk around three concepts. One is a perfect storm. The second is two-table diplomacy. And the third concept is status quo. And let me try to define each one of those and then try to work it into a talk about the upcoming elections in Taiwan. Perfect Storm is a book that some of you might know that I paid particular attention to as someone who sails in the Atlantic Ocean. It's about a confluence of factors that brought a perfect storm. And a perfect storm, as you know, that ultimately led to the deaths of a number of people who were at sea, and particularly one famous fishing boat. The thing about the perfect storm is two things. One is the sense of things coming together and coming together to cause a disaster. And the other thing about the perfect storm was a sense of helplessness. I think if any of you have sailed, you know that you can see weather, but there's not much you can do about it. And all you can do is try to just watch it happen. Two-table diplomacy is a term that some of you might know that was used by Bob Putnam at Harvard. And basically what Putnam argues is that in any diplomatic situations, any policymaker sits at two tables. One table is the table where he sits across from the international adversary or the international partner or the international friend. The other table is the table of politics at home, of what is constrained or what is possible or not possible due to the conditions of politics at home. And every diplomat is going back and forth between both tables. And having to consider the priorities of each table against the other table. In other words, internal politics counts, and in some situations it counts even as much as the international situation. The third term is status quo, and status quo simply means things as they are. There can be two types of status quo. There can be a stable status quo where all the actors are satisfied with the current situation. Or there can be an unstable status quo where one or more of the actors is dissatisfied with the situation, but is unable for whatever reasons to rectify that situation in their favor. What I'd like to argue this afternoon within the time allotted to me is that what's beginning to develop in the Taiwan Straits, I believe, is a perfect storm, is a confluence of factors that are in real danger of upsetting the very tenuous, unstable status quo that's existed in the Straits in the recent past, and that the cause of that is the intimate relationship on all three sides, the United States, China, and Taiwan, the intimate relationship between internal politics and external politics. The intimate relationship between the internal political balance, if you will, and the options that are open or not open to the statesmen or statespeople on all three sides. So let me just take a very quick run around the triangle, talk about the constraints that exist or the ways in which domestic politics are shaping the options or the foreign policies of each of the three actors, and then try to demonstrate to you the real dangers, I think, that exist in the Straits areas today. First, if you go to Taiwan, I think that's probably the easiest and the most obvious. What's occurring in Taiwan, of course, and has been for the last decade, is the growing salience of of identity politics. The growing salience of identity politics. Now, I think it's important to make the difference between two kinds of identity. There's ethnic identity, which is the normal way that in the past we've thought about ethnicity within Taiwan. That is the differences between Bunsheng and Weisheng, between the people who were on Taiwan before 1949 and those who came afterwards. Ethnic politics is certainly very important, but I think that over the last decade it's been eclipsed by what you might call, or ethnic identity rather, has been eclipsed by what you might call civic identity. That is, what's occurred in Taiwan over the last 10 to 20 years is an increasing identification with the constitutional structure of Taiwan, with Taiwan as a political entity. It's an identification that has very little to do with ethnicity, though it's clearly related to it. But it has more to do with a sense of national pride, a sense of identification with this political entity known as Taiwan. And a sense that given the economic accomplishments as well as the accomplishments inside Taiwan in terms of the political change that's gone on, that Taiwan deserves more recognition and that Taiwan deserves more credit than it's gotten from the world over the last 10 years. That's the reality, and that's a reality that I think will continue to intensify and will continue to shape politics in Taiwan for the near future. The growth of identity, Taiwan identity, has been, of course, accelerated by the victory of the DPP in the last election in the year 2000. Clearly, the DPP was the Independence Party. Clearly, the DPP was the party that was committed most fully to the fullest realization of the identity of Taiwan as a separate entity. And clearly the DPP was the party that was least committed to the idea of immediate and even eventual reunification with the mainland. So there's no question that the last 4 years have accelerated a process that was already in the process of growing and has intensified it. So all of that, of course, makes it very difficult and will make it very difficult over the next year for any government that's elected on March 20th to take immediate, substantial steps towards improving relations with the mainland. It's most likely, of course, that if Chen Shui-bian is elected, that the acceleration will continue. The best, I think, that one can expect if one is concerned about Taiwan identity and its impact on cross-strait relations is that the process will slow under the Kuomintang. But it seems unlikely that the Kuomintang would be able or even willing to resist it for its own political needs. So that's the domestic changes that are occurring in Taiwan that are beginning to threaten this unstable status quo that I talked about. On the mainland, it's very clear that the Taiwan issue is a domestic issue in two areas. The first area is in terms of state-society relations. As the leadership looks at society as a whole, and as the leadership looks at its position in the nation as the leaders of the Communist Party and as the de facto and de jure government of China. For three reasons, there are pressures on this leadership to solve the Taiwan question through reunification as soon as possible. And at least not to let it linger much longer, but most of all, not to allow Taiwan to separate from the mainland. And that, I might add, is the immediate policy of the mainland now, not reunification, but simply to stop a process of separation that they see going on. That separation is unacceptable to them for three reasons. The first reason is symbolic. And Taiwan, of course, represents the end of the revolution, the end of 1949, the final culmination, the finishing of the Civil War, the realization of communist victory, and the defeat of their opponents. Secondly, and more importantly, I think, it's the end of a century of humiliation. The fundamental cornerstone of the communist leadership in China today has two parts. One is nationalism, the other is economic benefit. Basically what the Communist Party is saying to the people of China is that you will live better in a great nation. That is our pledge to you. That is the reason why you should consider the Communist Party to be China's legitimate rulers. The Taiwan issue sitting out there as the one non-realized goal of a century of anti-imperialist revolution, of a century of China's standing up in the world, is seen by the leadership as damaging to that prop in its legitimacy. And of course, thirdly, and I think perhaps even becoming more apparent recently with Hong Kong, there's the issue of other possible separatist movements within China. Muslims, Tibet, but also Hong Kong. If they give in to or if they show weakness towards Taiwan separatism, what's going to come next? What will be the next shoe to drop? So in terms of state-society relations, those are, I think, the three major elements that drive the Chinese leadership's perception of the Taiwan issue and sense that it must not be allowed to get out of hand to the point that there is separation from the mainland. But there's also a second aspect of it, and that is intra-elite politics. As we all know, this is a new leadership. As I think we all possibly know, the issue of Taiwan and being soft on Taiwan or being easy on Taiwan, or the charge of being soft on Taiwan or easy on Taiwan, is the rough equivalent of being called a communist in this country during the McCarthy era. No Chinese leader can show weakness on the Taiwan issue. No new Chinese leader, most of all, can show weakness on the Chinese issue. No new Chinese leader with an old Chinese leader looking over his shoulder can show weakness on the Taiwan issue. And no new Chinese leader with an old Chinese leader looking over his shoulder and a few younger colleagues looking over his shoulder can show weakness on the Taiwan issue. So one would expect that the leadership would be more likely to take a strong stand rather than a weaker stand on the Taiwan issue. So for all those reasons, China now is really frozen in a position on the Taiwan question, part of which goes back to the middle 50s. All of which goes back to the middle 50s. And that position has two parts. One, China. Taiwan is a part of China, and that's a position that the mainland has not moved on since 1949. And the second is one country, two systems, which was first floated in the middle 1950s by Mao Zedong and by Zhou Enlai, and was later refined in its present version by Deng Xiaoping. So the second element is in the present storm, in the perfect storm, is not only the growing sense of identity or Taiwan identity on the island and the growing expression of it and the growing need to show it in real political actions, but a situation on the mainland where the leadership for various state society and inter-elite reasons is unable to respond to a very different situation, a very challenging situation, a very difficult situation, with anything more than policies that are 40 or 50 years old. We come to the United States. The United States has a long history of being in the middle of this fight, and we have a long history of not wanting to be in the middle of this fight. It begins with the Marshall Mission, and continues today. The salience of the Taiwan issue in the domestic politics of the United States also has a long history. It was clear during the Eisenhower administration. As I think most of us know, during the Kennedy administration, there's the famous conversation that Warren Cohn has documented very well between Dean Rusk and John Kennedy, where Kennedy said he was not about to touch the China issue in his first administration. With Johnson, things began to change, but American policy has a long tradition of being driven, particularly American policy towards China or towards the relationship between the Kuomintang or Taiwan and China has a long history of being driven by domestic politics. There are two elements, it seems to me, in the manner in which American politics has driven this question. From one perspective, there's the issue of ideology. It's been driven by anti-communism during the 50s and 60s. Today, it's driven by an ideology of anti-communism with a very strong dose of pro-Taiwan as a democratic country. So the ideology is an amalgam of those two factors. We both oppose communism, and like good Americans, we support democratic states. The politics of it, though, have been equally as important. There's a long tradition in American politics for the opposition to take advantage of the China issue as a political tool, going back to the McCarthy era and the debate over who lost China. During the Clinton administration, I think that what we saw was that marriage of ideology and politics. And particularly in the congressional opposition to Clinton's China policy and to Clinton's policy towards Taiwan, which opposed Clinton both on ideological grounds, on being too soft on China, but also for good political reasons as far as the Republican majority on the Hill was concerned. And it was a deadly combination. Today, under George Bush, I think that the issue is more ideology and less politics. Congress thus far has been under control. Congress thus far has not jumped into the fray. The big question, it seems to me, as we talk about now the third part of the perfect storm, the big question, it seems to me, is how long George Bush and the Bush administration will be able to maintain its relatively constraining policy on Taiwan. And it's a policy that, we could talk about this later, I think has begun to weaken somewhat from the famous statement in the White House with Wen Jiabao. How long will we be able to play this role of trying to maintain stability, trying to maintain a sense of impartiality in the Taiwan Straits. How long will it take before the election eventually begins to compel Bush to move to his natural political allies and begin to be sensitive to charges that he's being intolerant towards a democratic country and being overly tolerant towards a non-democratic country, towards a communist country. So American policy, it seems to me, is beginning to shift in a direction that is not favorable to the maintenance of this unstable status quo. So what I leave you with, it seems to me, I hope, is I think a very pessimistic picture. I think the trend lines in all three areas, largely because of the drift of internal politics, are moving all the actors away from a begrudging tolerance of the status quo, which has kept the peace for the last decade, towards a situation that, it seems to me, threatens the status quo and moves us, of course, further and further away from any kind of possible resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee.
I think I should begin with a disclaimer. I used to be a legislator on behalf of Kuomintang, KMT, in Taiwan legislature, but I never considered myself as a mainstream within the party. Therefore, today, I consider my presentation here much more a sort of personal appraisal of the Taiwan situation, especially Kuomintang's policy, from my own scholarly perspective. So I would never believe what I'm expressing here had anything to do with the mainstream Kuomintang itself. And with that disclaimer, I feel much more sort of comfortable to say how I want to say. I'm very much honored to be here, and I want to thank especially the center really invite me to come over. And the first time I'm standing here facing my distinguished and honorable audience that many of you I have heard and I have known, and I'm honored to give you my own personal opinion this afternoon. And Gang Lin organized this panel with the expectation that he's inviting two persons. One represent each color, the blue and the green. I think he's going to be disappointed.
Not totally.
Byron, Professor Wen, and I were good old friends. And we mostly really respect each other. At least I respect him. I don't know whether they respect him. And I know of him very, very long time. And in fact, today in our discussion, I think is very amicable and mutually understanding. In fact, in my experience, when I was a legislator in Taiwan, coming from outside and joined Taiwan politics, I was extremely uncomfortable. And especially the first session we have at that time, back in 1906, was voting on the nuclear power issue. And in fact, we were prepared. We had a drill, as Kuomintang's legislator. We have a drill that after the vote, there will be a helicopter coming from the sky to sort of pull us all up into helicopter and run away, you see, go to a hotel. That was a drill. But at the end of the vote, of course, there was turmoil, as usual, in the legislature. But at the end, nothing happened. So what I'm basically saying, this is a famous quotation in Taiwan politics is called the sort of wave inside the teapot, like wave inside the teapot. 茶壶里面的风波. So very much like this kind of thing. You see, you look at the outside, it's extremely turbulent. It's possible problem. But to the end, may not be. And I think that's what my overall appraisal of what is going to happen after next week. And it's coming. I could be wrong, of course. I mean, that I have to admit. But I don't think it's that much a pessimistic view of the Taiwan situation. So let me begin to present my discussion here in the PowerPoint. I think I appreciate most of you here today because you are concerned about the referendum issue. And the referendum is an important issue because the first time the country is allowed to have referendum. In the United States, referendum is such a common thing. But in Taiwan, because of what? Because of this, what's next? That's the issue. Therefore, Kuomintang have been very much resistant. To the end, it cannot resist the institutionalization of this thing called referendum. But this time, we are disappointed to see that referendum is not that, quote, deal with important issue. It really melted down to the point is whether we should purchase more weapons, the government should be authorized, and second, government should be authorized to negotiate with PRC. So it is not deal with domestic issue this time. It's much more a sort of external issue from Taiwanese point of view. So I am not so sure that it's going to exceed 50% of persons voting. Totally, there are about 15 million people, 14 million people, eligible voters. Now, it has to be 7 million vote for it. And I'm not so sure 50% is reachable with that referendum. Second, which is the most important thing, is what's the next. That's a typical response from U.S. Department of Secretary of State. The defense, it does change. The Chen Shui-bian's position does change from what he called the defensive referendum to what he called the preventive. Now, this is what he called the peace referendum. And of course, what's next? That many of you are concerned with this. Would that be in the year of 2006, there'll be a referendum of constitutional reform? Very possible. Very possible. But the question, would there be a formal declaration of Taiwan independence? And therefore, there will be an inevitable conflict between Taiwan and China. I don't think, even though that Chen Shui-bian won again, I don't think the DDP people is that stupid to incite PRC to engage in open conflict. Even though there will be a reform of constitution, I think the tuning, the word, will be such that it's much more domesticate rather than declare formal independence. Could be what they call 旧酒装新瓶. You know, there's a new content, new wine, but inside the old bottle. I think that formulation is more likely. Therefore, the PRC cannot say, you are Taiwan independent. You know, I don't think that is likely. But anyhow, that's what's next, we don't know. And this, of course, of concern with people. The third one, which my friend of mine, it should be said, right? No, Wang Jinping used to be my boss, the president of Taiwan Legislative Yuan. He was mentioning this possibility. And it is a very heated presidential race. So far, the poll has been shown the margin is very much 3%, at most 5%. And that 3% is all in thumbprint error. It's all possible. Therefore, it could be just 50-50. Nobody can say today, of course, except the candidate. He declared, everybody declares a winner at this time. but nobody, a serious academician, would dare to say who is going to win. So, and this is because so heated debate, we worry that it will be some disturbance coming. And that is inevitable, I think, in a local level. But I don't think it will be in the whole national level. Well, Taiwan democracy, why is so much problem? And Dr. Goldstein just mentioned, very true. It's very much an identity struggle. And identity struggle, of course, involved with this ethnic identity. And this becomes such a touchy issue in Taiwan today. In fact, Taiwan, we look at Taiwan's case, to me, is very worrisome because the north-south differential, Kuomintang in the north, DPP in the south, and that proportionality, I have examined the last 30 years, that proportionality, that party identity has increased, especially more dramatically in the last 10 years. That north-south. Not to mention between so-called Taiwanese and the mainlander. So that division, of course, is a problem. And that is whole thing to do with, this is what Li Denghuo was saying, this external party, that is Kuomintang, coming from outside, try to colonize Taiwanese people. And that kind of sentiment and is very strong, very strong. And you look at last week, or about February 28th, that you got, what? Professor Wang estimate 1.5 million people line up together, hand in hand, to show Taiwan identity. The strategy is almost like Mao Zedong back in 1960, you know? People's will, people's power, people's solidarity can win whatever it is. And that show of muscle certainly is very impressive, very impressive. And there's no deny about that. And why so? Because of this identity issue. Now, with this one China policy thing, well, this I would come to that much more sort of back to this question. What I try to mention is this is a clear difference between DPP and KMT. To DPP, they claim democracy is unconditional. Democracy is the thing that we hold that will get American to be on our side. An American, being a democratic supporter, should support with us all the way to fight against the authoritarian regime. And that kind of sentiment, that mentality, to what extent that's true or that's not true, that's for you to judge. But I'm trying to present here is that Kuomintang, the KMT, have sort of different sort of assessment here. What Kuomintang concern is democracy with the question of national security issue. You have to consider external factor. External factor. And this external factor, the reaction itself, is something that you have to push how far you can go. And there's boundary there. So don't be so naive not to realize the boundary of democracy. So at the time of so-called containment model of the United States foreign policy, Taiwan's democracy tend to be something which is very positive for U.S. to support Taiwan. That U.S. can support Taiwan wholeheartedly because this is becoming a democratic system. And therefore, it's good for supporting national security from the United States. Well, now time has changed. In the United States, it's the engagement era. The United States want to engage itself with China in resolving global issues, especially the Pacific issue. And therefore, in that sense, if you're pushing for unconditional democracy, that you think democracy of Taiwanese could be that important that the U.S. can commit itself wholeheartedly to support you? That kind of question to KMT people, that is naive. And that's why in this case, that under this era of engagement, democracy could become a problem with national security. And that is, I think, is what KMT keep talking about this day. Well, let me escape that and basically saying that what is the scenario of election outcome? I think nobody would know, but definitely I think that if DPP is elected, this cross-strait relation will continue to be storming. I don't think China is willing to give Chen Shui-bian a chance in the next 4 years. Why should they? They're in upper hand now. Why should they help you? They're perfectly willing not to help you. And still, you have to kowtow to them. And therefore, you have to give them more in the next 4 years if Chen Shui-bian is elected. And if you want to pursue this so-called dialogue in policy, it's become very difficult for Chen Shui-bian. On the other hand, if KMT does win, well, there's possibility, the so-called beginning of the so-called three links. And especially Dien Zhan just proclaimed that next year will be the opening the sea, the naval communication. So that's very likely. But I want to point out this concept and throw out to you. I think it's something here very Chinese. That is, there's two concepts here. One is called Taiwan Duli, Taiwan Independent, and that is DPP. That is the green camp's sort of ultimate goal. No question about that. The KMT has changed tremendously, especially in the last 4 years. After 4 years of losing power, the eye began to open, you see. Especially a guy like Dien Zhan, who is a classmate of Professor Wen, you see. That's what he said. Dien Zhan become more like person now. And I think the KMT has learned a lot in the last 4 years. So what the attitude is that? I call it independent Taiwan. What it means is that Taiwanese people refuse to be ruled by PRC. However, there shouldn't be any animosity toward the Chinese or people and even the Chinese regime. That there should be certain open dialogue, negotiation for peace. First thing we got to do in Taiwan, we have to change our military, the draft system. And we have to not to purchase too many weapons. And therefore, we began to show goodwill of dialoguing. I think that is what I call independent Taiwan. Taiwan being not ruled by PRC. But we want to buy the time to see to the end that China will be changed. And therefore, eventually, we can work much closer. May not be united, but at least work very close partnership. So that's the attitude, what I call the independent Taiwan. So that is different from Taiwan independence. So you can see in this kind of, for PRC, both are not acceptable. Of course, you see, PRC still regard Taiwan as a renegade province. Therefore, it's one China, period. That kind of thing. So, but I think within Taiwan, this kind of mentality is coming. It's coming. People much more accepting this kind of model, that independent Taiwan, all the time being, especially among Kuomintang. So that's why I mentioned that there's one country, that model. Dien Zhan one time was talking about, it's called confederation, but now many people stop him. Say, don't mention this. Just forget about the China thing. You know, there's just concern with Taiwan issue. So this one country, two system, that model, I think is something is not very much receptive in Taiwan. Well, to the end, let me discuss with you what could be the United States option interest. And this is for United States to decide, of course. United States had a commitment to democracy against authoritarianism, that's for sure. And especially that is very much emphasized among the DPP leaderships. The people very much believe that United States is behind this idealism. Second is this arms sale issue. That many people in Taiwan believe that United States would like continue to see that Taiwan purchase many weapons, perhaps more than what is needed, and that kind of pressure, and that's why this referendum, one of the referendum, is for purchasing more weapons. The third one is to what extent the United States wants to use Taiwan as a leverage to contain China influence in Asia. So this, of course, is strategic consideration. And there's no denial about that. And many Taiwanese people, they know that. That kind of American interests are there. However, there are things, what we call global democratic value. And I'm using this alternative here. These are the alternative, almost like what we call psychological scaling, that from one hand to the others. So there's consideration of global values, there's consideration of regional security, and should we defend Taiwan at all costs for the sake of maintaining peace? Or to the other end, should we just disarm Taiwan and make it as a neutral place as possible? The third question, of course, to what extent we want to allow Taiwan to unlock its relation with China. You see. And these are the sort of three considerations, in my judgment, that should be for the Washington policymaker to decide. And many of you here, I know, you are involved with Washington sort of policy-making process toward Taiwan. And especially many of you, I think we people in Taiwan look you up, for any kind of your insight for your decision. And you are very influential on that. So what could be the future of Taiwan to some extent, of course, is very much United States decision. But I think these three options, these three alternatives, three considerations, that's something I'm throughout here for you to decide, that what kind of role the United States will play in Taiwan. And I'm speaking much more of a long-term consideration. What the United States can do next week? None. I don't think U.S. can do anything. If it does, something will be dramatic and will be tremendous damaging to DPP. I don't think so. Yeah, so far it will be a sort of natural development within Taiwan itself. The only factor, only unexpected, I can see would be those, or how many people with Taiwan merchant will return from China. That we don't know. We're just discussing this afternoon. Could be somewhere like 100,000 voters, Taiwan merchant from China. And if they come back with 100,000 and multiplied by their family and so on, that is something within the margin of error, 3% to 5%. And therefore, that's something could be swing the vote in whatever way. So that's possibility. So thank you very much for putting up with me, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. Thank
you. Thank you, Dr. Lin. Indeed, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I was asked to talk about Taiwan's presidential elections. In my mind, the question is, what's happening in Taiwan? And why is Taiwan being billed as a troublemaker, one causing tension in the Taiwan Straits? I think that questions of this nature put Taiwan in a defensive position. I see my job as partly one of explaining Taiwan's experience, Taiwan's position, Taiwan's current difficulties, predicament, in the hope that somehow there will be a somewhat more sympathetic, more understanding reading of what's happening in Taiwan. There is indeed an election taking place, the presidential election of 2004. This particular election has big stakes. Now, mind you, we have two sets of candidates, the exact same individuals of 2000 running this time. On the DPP side is Chen Shui-bian and Annette Lu. On the Pan-Blue side, we have Lian Zhan, who also ran last time, and James Song, who ran against Lian Zhan last time. This time they're in a team with Lian Zhan being the the presidential candidate and James Song the vice presidential candidate. The issues, too, really do not differ from the last time too much, although the directions things are moving seem to be quite different, and I'll try to explain that in a bit. If Lian Zhan or James Song should lose this particular election, I think that's the end of their political career. Fairly clear about that. Chen Shui-bian, we don't know. He's younger. And competition within his party, though they are there, is such that he may still have a chance, maybe 1 or 2 terms later. We don't know. But shall we say the candidates on the Pan-Blue side, by comparison, is somewhat more desperate. The parties have serious matters at stake. KMT, earlier Dr. Lee was saying in a different setting that KMT may become dysfunctional if they should lose this particular election. Well, I'm not quite as pessimistic, although if you look back, you'd notice that KMT has split into 4 parties within a relatively short period of time, less than 10 years. First, there was a new party that splintered and became a separate entity. That party is no longer truly a contending party. It simply didn't have enough support. Then there is the People First Party, James Song's party. And mind you, Lee Teng-hui's party, the Taiwan Solidarity Union, also came out of KMT. That tells you something about this party, does it not? At one time, it's called the richest party in the world. Today, it's a party that is supposedly running into financial difficulties. I don't know how that happened, but anyway, that's a change that has taken place in a very short period of time, and that party is today struggling. There is relatively few new blood going into that party, and this particular election for them, in that sense, has a lot to do with its future. The island's political regime, democracy, through this particular election is going to institutionalize a new mechanism called referendum. You see, referendum was provided for in the Constitution of 1947. Article 17 of that Constitution said the people have the right to 创制复决, roughly translated, I suppose 创制 means to take initiative, 复决 means to review. That is, if the parliament fails to enact something the people want, the people can initiate something. And if the parliament passes something the people don't want, they can review and reject it, or something to that effect. Those are commonly referred to in our parlance as referendum. Actually, there's in English another word called plebiscite. Plebiscite has to do with the decision of a territory's future, in my understanding of it. Puerto Rico has a plebiscite, Quebec may have a plebiscite, except that in our language, it seems the word referendum could also cover plebiscite. It's a bit confusing. And that confusing nature appears also in the Chinese language. This thing called referendum suddenly came into the picture in a big way this time. And it becomes so controversial that it draws the United States, Japan, France, other EU members into the picture, and we are in the middle of a controversy over this. It is threatening to influence the election outcome as well. It is one of the important factors. Well, unfortunately, in the historical experience of Taiwan, the word referendum or 公投, 公民投票, is confused too often with 自觉, self-determination. Self-determination is a kind of plebiscite, often confused. That's because the initial provision in the Constitution was never invoked throughout the entire period of authoritarianism. Of course, for obvious reason, they won't come into the picture. Once Taiwan began to move on to travel the road of democracy, the word comes up. Unfortunately, in the initial period, only the independence movement people speak about it. People like Trong Tsai, Tsai Tong-rong, spent a lot of time pushing this thing. Taiwan's future must be determined by Taiwan people. And then you have DPP resolution that speak of the need to have a referendum if Taiwan's future is to be changed, something to that effect. And so before the current invocation of this referendum, there is already a mindset in Taiwan, and unfortunately in mainland China as well, that referendum is a movement, is a tool for movement towards independence. That equation, very simplistic, comes to stick. And as Taiwan moves ahead, mainland seems to stay on that same frame of mind without changing. Taiwan today speak of referendum, and I think Dr. Lee really was moving in that direction, in the hope that somehow this will become a mechanism for more advanced form of democracy. That's the way Taiwan talks about it, a more direct democracy as a supplement to the representative system. And through this system, somehow they hope, for instance, that the Constitution can be reformed so that the current imperfection can be corrected and so forth. That, however, is not taken to mean referendum for a mechanism of democracy, but rather referendum is simply equated as independence or creeping independence or something of that nature in Beijing and concurrently in other places. This mechanism, institution of this, I think is to be remembered in history as the work of the elections of 2004 in Taiwan. And finally, I think my two previous speakers both touch upon this question of national identity. This election is supposed to be also one in which the future of Taiwan in relation to its national identity could be determined. If not determined at this elections, at least the direction of that development would be determined by these elections, because it's read that if DPP wins, it's going to move towards independence. If the KMT wins, that movement would at least be stopped, slowed down, if not turned around. These are the stakes. What I see are important salient features that deserve some attention in these elections. I've already talked about the referendum, which is indeed one important aspect of it. There can be said a lot more about it, but I'll move on. Another interesting thing that's worthy of note about these elections is that compared to the last one, both sides, the pan-blue and the pan-green, have come to embrace a move towards greater self-assertion on the part of Taiwan in terms of future directions. That is, if I put it in a different way, DPP continues to push towards that goal, and you see DPP and Taiwan Solidarity Union together engaged in activities such as rectification of name. There was a movement, there was a street demonstration where they said the name ought to be corrected. The most extreme of this form speak of the change of name from ROC to ROT, Republic of Taiwan. But the more limited forms would say, put the word Taiwan on the passport for ROC, or change our street name, which has such and such, into something more in tune with, or that the TICO office in the United States or in other foreign capitals that represents Taiwan be simply directly called Taiwan Economic and Cultural Office rather than Taipei, some such. That rectification campaign is the work of people in the pan-green camp more than it is the pan-blue. Except that, very interestingly, as the election campaign goes on and the mood of the people was perceived to be moving in this or that way, as public opinion polls time and again reveal some such, we see that the pan-blue moving in that same direction. Pan-blue used to hold fast for the position of one China principle, at least the so-called 1992 consensus. But as of November 12, Lian Zhan openly embraced referendum. 3 days later, Lian Zhan says the Blue Camp has a 3-point plan and Blue Camp would want to push for a constitutional overhaul by the year 2005. And just about a month later, Lian Zhan says he now accedes to the two-state theory of Chen Shui-bian, and that Wang Jinping, Lian Zhan's campaign manager, says openly, yes, Taiwan independence is an acceptable alternative. Now you see, Pan-Green did not truly change its position in this regard, but Pan-Blue did. Both parties are shifting towards independence in that direction because they read that that is a mainstream mood in Taiwan. In this campaign, this particular shift, therefore, is to me of some significance, and I'm sure Beijing is unhappy about that. Beijing is not particularly unhappy that DPP continues to move in the direction it does. Beijing surely must be very unhappy that Pan-Blue, too, came into this picture in this fashion. That's one important shift in this election that we have seen so far. The other is both sides leaning more and more towards economic engagement and potential integration of some sort economically with mainland China. Here, again, it's the mass psychology that's changing that made the parties move. In this case, KMT used to be more in the forefront. That is, they want the three links. They want the government to loosen its control over investment and other trade activities with mainland China, while the DPP on its part says it's concerned with security, and because of security they have various policies that limits or restrict or slows down some of these engagement with mainland China. But as the campaign picks up, we see that the DPP, too, jumping on the same wagon because they now see that Taiwan's own economy indeed can no longer develop itself without taking into consideration the mainland element. And this acceptance of the fact that Taiwan's economic future is already quite closely tied to the mainland has made the DPP shift its position in that direction as well. I think these two major shifts, one perhaps is a result of what's called nativization, 本土化. The other perhaps because of the seemingly real hollowing effect of the economy caused by the rise of Beijing rise of mainland China in the economic field. These things are influencing this particular election quite significantly. But because the stake is high, and because these shifts are something that's ongoing and developing, and both sides are trying to gain an advantage, and Taiwan, in a sense, is small, and the media competition is so keen, we see the election campaign heating up unnecessarily, sometimes a little ugly in its presence. And I perceive in that process a kind of zero-sum mentality, and I don't like it. I think if you have a zero-sum way of thinking, you think you're either going to lose all, and therefore you must use more extreme methods to try to wrest the situation and gain back potential advantages. That, too, seems to be a kind of influence on the election situation. But perhaps I want to shift a little bit from here and speak about that perfect storm that Steve has referred to. Not much of a storm, it seems to me. The storm is projected in terms of the potential war that may come from such development that we are talking about. What is that storm? What is the nature of that storm? That storm means Beijing may use force to attack Taiwan. Is that not? Effectively, there is a storm only because the potential of Beijing firing its gun is there. If there is no such threat, there is no storm to speak of. So far, what have we seen? What we see, actually what I see, is that because Beijing wants to make sure that the blue camp, their preferred party, is elected and that the pan-green is prevented from winning yet another election this time, they are trying their best to influence this particular election. But because in the two previous presidential elections, they tried and they experienced the boomerang effect. 1996, there was the Straits military crisis, and it helped Lee Teng-hui get elected with 5% more votes than projected. In the year 2000, Zhu Rongji came on the television and very sternly told the Taiwan people, you better elect the right person. And Chen Shui-bian was elected, precisely the one they don't want. This time, Beijing is particularly sensitive about the situation, and they bend backward not to interfere. But they don't stay lying down doing nothing, do they? They work indirectly through Washington, through Paris, through Tokyo, and they tell Washington and other capital, look, you better rein in Taiwan. These people are doing something dangerous. If you don't stop them, I'm going to be forced to have to fire my gun. Well, we know that the Americans are, of course, in no positions to start a third front. We already have two fronts out there in Afghanistan and Iraq. A third front is surely not what we want. I heard Brzezinski talking last night. He speaks quite convincingly, in a way, of the danger that America may lose its preeminence because we are already bogged down in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Middle East, and potentially also Iran, and to have another such front in Asia where Korean experience and Vietnam experiences are both unhappy ones would be foolhardy. And the potential enemy being China, of course, that's a no-no. That gives Beijing tremendous advantage, doesn't it? North Korea thrown in the picture as well. And so Beijing was able to convince Washington. I went to France just a few days before Chirac greeted Hu Jintao. You see, France and China had this China culture year culminating in the visit of Hu Jintao. And when Hu came, Chirac told Taiwan, no, don't you do that referendum. It's no good. It's going to cause tension. Why is everybody dancing to that background music from Beijing? Isn't that kind of funny? I read to you a couple of passages from the recent March 4 issue of Far Eastern Economic Review, which has an editorial, and the editorial contains the following couple of statements. It says, China could lessen tension if it were to attempt to better appreciate the very people it has designs over. It asks, why, while Mr. Chen Shui-bian in Taiwan is chided, China's threats are seen as expected and normal. I think these are very good questions indeed. Now, my teacher, Peng Mingmin, a few days ago at a different setting, made an example. He says a man points a gun at another and threatens to shoot. The man whose head has a gun at it tries to extricate himself from that situation. And all the outsiders jump at that fellow and say, don't you move. Don't you do anything silly. Well, yes, the warning may have some meanings to it, but there's something wrong, certainly, if the guy pointing the gun is himself never chided, never blamed, never called into question in this picture. That, I think, is something very funny, seems to me. But when all of that is said, I still say there's not much of a storm, because the threat really is a hollow one. We see China, we study China, we research China, we make judgment on China, and we see that China too has a handful with its domestic problems. China has priorities elsewhere. China really wants to prevent independence, but they don't see that independence coming on so quickly. What they're concerned with is something called creeping independence. They say referendum is a prelude to a later plebiscite, which they want to prevent, and therefore they want to stop it now rather than later. That is a concern, and that is a threat. We understand all of that, but why should that therefore be the justification for Taiwan not to hold a referendum? If that referendum is for the purpose of constitutional reform, and the reform is about betterment of the parliamentary system, or to make the president, the office, more responsible, answerable to the parliament, or something of that nature. You see, this blanket reaction, seemingly orchestrated reaction from various capitals trying to stop Taiwan from holding the referendum, to me, did not seem justifiable. But let me go on beyond this. I probably would take up a minute or two longer, but just 1 or 2 minutes. Taiwan was not a democracy before. Before 1988, of course, the principle of one China was there. That's the principle upheld by Chiang Kai-shek and his son Chiang Ching-kuo. These are authoritarian regimes. When they were ruling, if the president speaks, all the other discussions stop. Nobody speaks anymore. After they died and Li Tenghui succeeded, if Li Tenghui speaks, if there's no 10 answers, it's strange. If there's not 15 answers to Chen Shui-bian today, it's also abnormal. What happened? We have democratized. What does that mean? That means the voice of the people for the first time has become real and is present. When the voice of the people come out, what happened to the principle of one China? In 1979, Beijing made that overture to Taiwan, saying to our compatriots in Taiwan, let's no longer fight, let's have 3 links and 4 exchanges. Chiang Ching-kuo responded with a 3 no's policy. No negotiations, no contact, no compromise. Did Chiang Ching-kuo consult the people? Was there people's voice involved in that decision? Wouldn't the people want to have 3 links and 4 exchanges better than continuing hostilities between the two sides? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe yes. But at least if there was democracy and the people's voice were first heard, maybe the situation would have been different. But there was no such. And since the ruling elite of those days want one China principle, of course the one China principle was never challenged. But with democracy, mind you, people say, hey, what's one China doing for us in Taiwan? Who in the world would think of one China as Taiwan? And if you continue to uphold one China principle, how can Taiwan ever enjoy a status internationally? How can Taiwan protect its own constitutional sovereignty to determine its own fate? If you hold on to one China principle, the politicians say, and the people swallow it, and it became the mainstream that says, indeed, one China principle is not good for Taiwan. I'm cutting the story short, but I'm trying to say to you, one China principle is rejected by the people when democracy becomes real. With Taiwan's democracy, one China principle is called into question, and that is at the root of the difficulties that we have today. And if you think that opposing Taiwan's referendum today is going to solve the problem, I'm afraid you're not quite correct in your judgment. My point is, if you want to support democracy, and democracy results in the people having a voice, a concerted, fairly large, fairly loud, mainstream voice that says one China principle is no longer tenable, in a sense, it now says the American policy of one China principle is out of date, is no longer in tune with reality where Taiwan is concerned. And that is going to come back time and again to influence not only cross-strait relations, but also America's policy towards Greater China. You have to take that into consideration if you want to answer that question. What's happening in Taiwan? Why is it causing so much trouble? Status quo, yes, but it's never constant. It's changing. Taiwan has changed the meaning of status quo through that process. So is China changing the status quo by deploying the missiles. So is China changing the status quo by strangulating Taiwan internationally. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Pillsbury.
It seems to me that Bob Hathaway and Lin Gong have made a mistake inviting me to be the commentator, because I can see in the audience at least 6 people who know more about this subject than I do. And I'm going to call out their names and hope that they will either take my place right now or at least ask a question or in the guise of asking a question and make some good comments themselves. Warren Cohen here in the front row, Nancy Tucker, author of a book on this subject, Bonnie Glaser. I see Ralph Clough, I think, in the back. Leo Orleans. There's a guy who resembles Don Kaiser, but it just can't be. So that said, let me say these are 3 wonderful presentations. They can't all be right. We have some metaphors in conflict, and I want to confine my comments to those metaphors. The perfect storm seems to me raises the question of war and when, and whether there's a confluence of factors in Taipei, Washington, and Beijing that are leading to war. It's a very serious hypothesis that Professor Goldstein has put forward. It's worth a lot of thought. It seems to me that the classic book so far on why wars begin, or the causes of war, Steve Van Ivera from MIT, stresses misperception, miscalculation. Wars almost never begin, he says, because people calculate in advance. Gee, I think I'll invade that guy and get his gold or something. It's through a process of miscalculation and escalation. So I take the perfect storm metaphor to be a larger question. How accurately are Beijing, Taipei, and Washington perceiving or understanding each other's positions? And here I think Professor Goldstein makes a very good point. I believe there is misperception on all three sides. I'm not sure the perfect storm is coming so soon, as Professor Goldstein implies. My fear is really 2 or 3 or 4 years away, not because of the election or in the coming year. And let me say why. First of all, I think in Beijing we have what I would call the dream team of foreign policy experts. The combination of Li Jiaoxing as foreign minister, who used to be ambassador here, who's a very outstanding analyst, Zhou Wenjun, who's a frequent visitor here now, even into the Pentagon. He shows no fear of the Americans. He's a very shrewd observer, very astute. China's ambassador here, Tiger Yang, is superb. Some of the stories out of Beijing in the last few months about the Central Party School getting 2 million yuan to do a study of the peaceful rise of China and why China will be an exception to the rising powers who provoke war, as Germany did at the more than once. This is all, to me, this is all evidence of a very astute approach to foreign policy. I have a very hard time believing that this dream team in Beijing could miscalculate to the point of war over Taiwan. That said, I am afraid of one thing, and that is the group of people, politicians, who go from Taiwan to Beijing to visit, and they scare Beijing. They turn up what I would call Beijing's fears. Not so much with the dream team that deals with the U.S., but with Beijing's experts on Taiwan and with Beijing's military leaders. They say things like this. Chen Shui-bian is going to go independent, for sure. You've got to stop him. If you back us, we'll be with you later. Now, when a foreign party does this, sometimes it's at least unethical. But when it does it when there's a chance of war and some misunderstanding on Beijing's side of the nature of Taiwan politics, it's really quite dangerous. That's why I'm afraid. I don't think the dream team that handles relations with the U.S. is the same as the experts on Taiwan. So that's where a miscalculation and the possibility of a perfect storm that Professor Goldstein mentioned comes in, it seems to me. Now, the second capital where there could be misperceptions, I'll go to Taipei next. There's some strange stories coming out of Taipei just in the last few weeks. We have Chen Shui-bian saying actually he is willing to shake hands with Hu Jintao in a Disandi in the third place. Hong Kong, I think he mentioned Indonesia. We have the DPP also talking about how they really are going to open up economic opportunities with the mainland faster than the KMT. As Professor Wang said, the KMT has been shifting its position over the past year or more to come closer to the DPP in many areas. Wang Jinping saying that independence cannot be ruled out as an option. I agree with you, Professor Wang. That's very significant. Some of the things Lian Zhan has said in the debates, the two TV debates in Taiwan, also are moving closer to the DPP position. But do the two parties, experts on foreign policy, have misperceptions? That's the question back to the perfect storm. And I would say here I'm a little bit worried. Because they're having a debate fairly recently over whether there is a 1992 consensus or not. And in the American press, our reporters and scholars tend to play up the 1992 consensus in Singapore as a pretty big deal, pretty big accomplishment in cross-strait relations. It's in all the basic books now that talk about the period. But we have the DPP saying actually there was no consensus, nothing was exchanged. It was really a draft press release. In Chinese they call it a 新闻稿 or 新闻稿子 that was never released. It was just something that the two deputies there, not Gu Zhenfu and Wang Daohan, but the two deputies talked about this, and they sort of drafted something, but it was never released. Then there was an exchange of faxes that were not signed. So now DPP is saying, in some sense, rewriting history. There's no consensus to go back to because there never was one in the first place. That could be significant. None of our paper presenters mentioned that, but that's troubling to me. The response of the KMT has not been good on this. The KMT has not released the documents or tried to make a good case. And the KMT man in Singapore he's retired now. He's maintained a very tactful silence. So one of you enterprising reporters, if you can go see the KMT man from the Foreign Ministry and get the true story, you have a chance to reduce misperceptions on whether there was a 92 consensus to go back to. Now, the third area for misperceptions is Washington. And here we have the problem of the referendum. Is a referendum good or bad for Taiwan to have? Well, some American officials in public have said, we do not oppose all referenda. So, 推测出来, there's good referenda and bad referenda. Now, what is the exact nature, from the point of view of the U.S., of these two referendum questions? The first one is about missile defense. But we're already hearing in the press in Taiwan that after the election, no matter who wins, blue or green, the Defense Ministry has already drafted a special budget request for $15 billion that they're going to present to the Legislative Yuan. And they expect it will pass. They seem to have some reassurances that even the KMT members, I take your point, Professor Lee, that some in the KMT want to not buy too many weapons, and they're very suspicious that the weapons are some kind of an American plot to force weapons on poor little Taiwan, which didn't really want them, to make money, or some evil American purpose to contain China. But actually, I don't think this is the American motivation. And I don't think the Legislative Yuan majority sees it that way. If the $15 billion special budget passes, it covers more than missile defense. It covers the P-3 patrol aircraft or something like that. Definitely the missile defense, which would be a small part. It would be about $3 billion out of the $15 billion. Covers Boeing Apache attack helicopters. It covers quite a few. It covers the submarine program. So if the budget passes with or without the referendum passing, it's not exactly a perfect storm brought about by the election. Other factors were at play. And here it seems to me, back in Washington, the third and last stop on my worries about misperception, we have the issue of what deters Beijing from the use of force. Why has there been no use of force against Taiwan? And here we seem to have a debate in Washington, which could be based on misperceptions. One says the more weapons we sell Taiwan, the more dialogue and military contact, survey teams, Monterey talks, these things, the less the chance Beijing will use force. So we need to continue this upward curve, which frankly, I disagree with Professor Goldstein about his characterization of the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration, and God bless them for this, started all this. They started the talks, they started the survey teams, they started the major weapon sales, some of which can hit mainland targets, like the sales that were approved in public by the Clinton administration. This didn't begin with President Bush, by any means. In many ways, his administration has continued the very same trend. So that's one point of view. The other point of view says, no, we can avoid the use of force, we can prevent war, we can prevent the perfect storm if we can be sure that Taipei and Beijing have dialogue, some kind of constructive dialogue, that in itself, plus economic ties, will prevent war. And that's where the perfect storm does have some merit. Because if all these factors I've mentioned are at work, if KMT people go to Beijing and say they're going to have independence, you better stop them and support us, that means Beijing needs more deterrence than before, more weapons than before, you might say. If the DPP wins, some people in Beijing's paranoia is confirmed. So again, the chances of war go up, the need for deterrence goes up. You notice how the chances for dialogue, all three speakers have mentioned, that perhaps the KMT can do a better job returning to the constructive dialogue and the 92 consensus. I question that. If I were in Beijing analyzing what Lian Zhan and Song Chuyu, which, by the way, if you don't know, they're both PhDs in political science from U.S. universities, Georgetown and Chicago, so they shouldn't have any misperceptions at all. But here's Lian Zhan saying, actually, he says, I believe in one China, but that one China is Republic of China. Well, nobody in Beijing can accept that. And you'll notice, this is my last point, Lin Gang, when Lian Zhan has said many times during the campaign, I want to make a 和平之旅, he's going to make a journey of peace when he becomes president. Beijing has not accepted this. Said, oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. You're welcome in Beijing anytime. I think Beijing will have conditions on the journey of peace that will include the one China principle and certainly the consensus of 92. So there may not be any journey of peace. So we're back to these dilemmas in Washington of what prevents war. Dialogue, economic integration, patience, the dream team in Beijing I mentioned, or more deterrence and increased military ties with the Taiwan military. So I'm not the smartest commentator. I told you that already. There are 5 or 6 in the audience who can do better than me. And I don't agree with all 3 papers, but each of them has a lot of merit. And I especially like the metaphor of whether this is a small wave in a teacup. It's a good challenge to the metaphor of the perfect storm. 谢谢各位.
Thank you. I bet all of you enjoyed a wonderful presentation by 4 of our speakers. And let me open the floor for discussion right away. And the first question goes to the gentleman over there.
Nick Berry, Foreign Policy Forum. Great presentations. Do go out on a limb a bit. Who's going to win? We won't attribute this to you at all. Just give us your best guess.
All right, I'll be the first. I think it'll be Pan Blue. I think there are several reasons for that. I don't believe that 100,000 voters are going to come back from the mainland. I think that's physically impossible, given the transportation. But I think the key is in the undecided votes. And if you've been following the trends the last 3 or 4 days, there was a brief period about a week ago when the DPP actually seemed to be doing better than Pan Blue, or Pan Green seemed to be doing better than Pan Blue. In the last 3 or 4 days, that's widened out again with a 6 to 7 point margin for Pan Blue, which still with a plus or minus of 3 still makes it a very slight margin. But I think that the KMT knows one thing, that it has to get the vote out, and I think it will. And I think that the bulk of the undecided votes are, in fact, KMT votes. So I'll predict a Pan Blue victory.
I won't predict Victor, but I will tell you I think there are things in play. There are cards yet to be played on both sides over the next 10 days that will determine the outcome. I think it's that close to call. There are too many undecideds. Some polls say 27, 30% undecided. The turnout is a big factor, but to me the most exciting factor is the charges and countercharges. We have this gentleman in California who says he bribed the First Lady and paid for her bathroom to be upgraded where she receives visitors in her wheelchair and has a hot tub and so forth. And she denies this, and he says, well, I've actually been in the bathroom. And she says the bathroom is frequently appears on the front page of the newspapers. Of course, you have no knowledge of my bathroom. And this is a sort of front page attack. The American government got into it because the government of Taiwan would like to arrest this gentleman and bring him home under other charges. And the U.S. government, according to the newspapers, is not helping in this effort, which would seem to be favoring one side. Another moment is going to be this huge island-wide demonstration next week. I think it's the 13th, right? 13th. Yes. Where the KMT is going to have a march for the corruption and the black gold and so forth, that the DPPs, they're going to try to focus on corruption on the part of the ruling party. And they promise to have some more, oh God, what's the expression? There's a wonderful expression, Mang Bao Hei Liao, I think it is. Mang Bao Hei Liao, to reveal the black stuff toward the end of an election. And they promise a lot of this next week, even beyond the bathroom scandal and some of the other scandals. So this is all very exciting. It's the kind of thing which can cause more turnout on one side or the other. There are probably several other cards to be played. Beijing, as I say, the dream team may not be in charge of Taiwan. They may do something at the last minute. I don't think it'd be military, but they may say something. And finally, the United States. When I was there last week, there are all kinds of paranoid views that the United States is somehow intervening secretly on one side or the other. Actually, both sides want to portray themselves as being a better friend of the United States. So they welcome some sort of secret intervention if they can convince the voters of this. And actually you have people implying the opposite, that the Americans don't really want my opponent. So that's still left to play out. Any American who says something that seems to favor or not favor a candidate can find himself or herself on the front page in the Taiwan newspapers. That's just a short list of the excitement left to go. So I don't disagree with Professor Goldstein. Pan Blue might win. But I think you should all be aware, there's a law in Taiwan that during the last 10 days, you cannot reveal the results of polls, public opinion polls. Imagine if we had that here. So
That's as of tonight.
If the professor says this in Taiwan, he goes to jail, as I understand it, if he gives polling data that's recent. So this is a very exciting race. That's why I'm going to be an observer. 谢谢.
Let me just say very briefly, because Dr. Pillsbury raises an interesting point. I must put my cards on the table and say that, in my judgment, the referendum has absolutely nothing to do with Taiwan's democratic system or the enhancing of it. And I think it's an argument that I just can't accept. I found it ironic, and I still find it ironic when friends from Taiwan tell me that, and yet this campaign, in terms of a democratic level, has been pathetic. And that is that, Dr. Pillsbury can make these points, and they're all valid, that these have been the major issues. The First Lady's bathroom. Both parties, in my judgment, have shirked the responsibility of parties in a real democratic system, and have failed to present the voters with real alternatives. And rather, what the referendum represents to me is simply a symbol of the whole election and the whole election campaign, where canards are thrown out in the place of real policy debates and real policy issues. And I find that sad. No kidding.
Let the record show that was Warren Cohen who said that.
If I may, the earlier issues are about the economy. And the question of war and peace really didn't come into the campaign picture until the referendum question results in Chen Shui-bian's decision to invoke Article 17 of the new referendum law. That's relatively late. But on the question of economy, which has to do with the economy hollowing out and unemployment rate being high, deficit being large, and overseas, not overseas, but mainland China investment and trade, tax policies, and so forth. Now, these issues are still there, but the KMT, which used to have an advantage over these issues, seem to have toned down quite a bit as Taiwan's economy seems to have recovered relatively well. The question of national identity is very much at the center of things. And on this, I think two have come together with the DPP seems to be the one taking some initiatives and the PAN-Blues on the reactive side of things. The issue over cohesion of the party, well, not issues, but I mean observations over cohesion of the parties, I think there is a nagging difficulty within the PAN-Blue camp. There are suspicions of James Song's intention or possibilities of him somehow overriding Lian Zhan, if not now, after the elections, and so forth. There are issues that relates to Hakka and other minority groups, but they seem not to me to be of key importance. The more important group that people are talking about are these investors in mainland China. We have just heard a report from people who study this question specifically that indeed there are at least 100,000 returning to vote. Wow. Because all the tickets are sold for a period of time, and if you count the number of seats available for this whole period...
They swim.
Which tickets?
Flights through Hong Kong and Macau.
For 100,000 people?
For a period of probably a month or something like that. Yeah, it's calculated. People have done the calculation, and they said indeed there will be a huge number. Even if it's not 100,000, if you cut it by a half, you would have to also count that the relatives of these merchants have long returned to Taiwan long before this in anticipation, and that each of these people, if they do take the act, they would try to influence their friends and relatives when they go back to Taiwan, so that the influence may be quite considerable. That indeed is a factor. And since the elections are neck to neck, that type of things, one particular group making a difference may well sway the election results. That's the kind of game that we are observing. I cannot myself make any prediction. I see that the PAN-Blue led the public opinion poll for quite a long time, usually with a small margin, but always ahead, until the 228 hand-in-hand demonstration. That 228 hand-in-hand demonstration seems to be one single event that seemed to have turned the public poll results overnight and giving the DPP for the first time a lead, even though only a couple of percentage points. It's very close, so that a last-minute event could change the results, could affect the result. Last time, we noticed that Li Yuanzhe, one person well-respected, could swing quite a number of votes, and his coming out at the last minute made a difference. Xing Piao-an, the corruption case associated with James Song, apparently cost him something. Beijing's Zhu Rongji outburst cost the blue team something. So that last-minute event, as I think Michael was talking about, is likely to be one very important factor in this particular elections.
So still too early to tell. Mm-hmm. And let me pick up a couple of questions. Let me see. Over there.
I'm Yoshi Komori of the Sankei Shimbun of Japan. And as we all know, the three countries, United States, France, and Japan, have all expressed, or their government representatives expressed opposition to the referendum in Taiwan. And either Mr. Li or Mr. Wang can answer the following question. How or to what extent has this message coming from those countries affected or affecting people's attitude in terms of voting? And secondly, of all the three countries, Japan has a distinctly different relationship with Taiwan, and I wonder if you detected any reaction on the part of people particularly different from their reaction to the U.S. or French president's leadership opposing that referendum.
Good. Another question go to Mr. Xue. You want to raise a question? Yeah. Microphone over there.
Yeah, my name is Xue Haipei. I'm from mainland China. I guess because of that, I may be a little bit biased or also a little bit naive. I try to minimize both. I want to have this question from Dr. Wen about DPP and democracy. A lot of us from mainland China that studied in the United States, we had a hard time figuring out why, since DPP has such a long suffering history of from a lack of democracy in Taiwan, why wouldn't you just share a little bit of your concern for democracy with China too? I can give you an example. For example, why couldn't you put a negotiation with China and say, well, you want me one China, give me back your one democracy system in mainland China? We never hear DPP say that. I guess it's that's my naivety from what I mean. And also, I want to say one thing about this democratization slash referendum. Even short of a war, if this thing's going down the hill like this, I think it will be insulting the intelligence of everybody here to say that whatever this referendum has nothing to do down the road with anything about independence. Now, even if short of a war or perfect storm, I personally would predict very safely that down the road that will help create a Chinese mentality on the mainland China, which is less democratic, which will be much more militarized, which give kind of a more shrill nationalism, and probably even will derail the whole normalization of China. I'm from mainland China. I just can't take that as a given, and I would not stand for that. Lastly, also related, I just in my wildest imagination, can I ask Dr. Wang whether DPP can do something like Nixon going to China in terms of one China policy?
Good.
I'm not sure I understand the last point about Nixon going to China.
And even for one China policy or regional integration of Greater China area.
Effectively accepting one China principle is what you're talking about.
No, it takes an anti-communist to open up China. That's the Nixon analogy.
By selling Taiwan down the drain.
No,
This would be after the election.
I think the Republican Party will be interested to hear that. I have heard from high officials, which I'll be happy to tell you when we're done, in the DPP administration who have presented that as an argument for Chen Shui-bian's election. That is that he has the credibility as an advocate of Taiwan's separate status to go to China and to negotiate, whereas the KMT is under suspicion because of its pro-mainland suspicions. It has nothing to do with selling out, and it's a Nixon analogy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. No.
He asked you.
I thought there were other questions, but
He also asked
Sankei
you
Shimbun
why
question.
doesn't DPP express any concern for democracy on the mainland? That was his other, sure.
Something like that, yeah.
Because your question of democracy in some way, willing or unwillingly, somehow has something to do with China's democracy.
And I want to know how much time that the chairman's going to give me.
Let me see what time. About 3 minutes. Well, only 6 minutes left.
I'll try my best. referendum has nothing to do with democracy, or referendum has nothing to do with independence. Both are wrong, of course. Do I need to explain a lot about that? I don't think I need to. Both are not quite accurate. Taiwan has its own experience of introducing referendum, and there is specific historical momentum that led to this point. The fact is, first there was none. Then Chen Shui-bian proposes it. The Pan Blue opposes it. And then the public opinion says they support it. So the Pan Blue come along to support it. Then the United States says it's no. Then the Pan Blue opposes it. That's how it is. And the Pan Blue says you can't have it without a law. And the Pan Green says, yes, we can. We can have consultative referendum for reference purposes only. Well, whatever it is, then a law is passed. But the law, this referendum law passed on November 27th last year, is said to be, by the Pan Green people, a bird cage referendum law. Why? First of all, it says if the people want to initiate something, they have to have the signature of 5% of all those who voted in the last presidential elections. That's a whopper of a sum. Very large number, very hard to get. Next, the most important thing is that there is to be a screening committee. And the screening committee is to be composed according to party representation in proportion with the last elections. Now, you want to have a referendum in Taiwan. It's introduced for this reason, that there is a cohabitation where the executive and the parliament belong to two separate parties, and nothing goes through the parliament, and so the frustrated people says we have to overcome that, let's have referendum. So the referendum was introduced as a mechanism to supplement the shortcomings as judged about the representative system where bills are not passing, programs are not possible to implement. So you want to cut through that. And the Pan Blue in turn adopts a law that says this screening committee will decide what goes in the referendum, but the screening committee itself is again the same as a parliament. You're back to square one. So you make it impossible. And then there is Article 30 of the referendum law says to be valid, the referendum must have half of all the eligible votes casting their vote. And of that, a half must support it. That's a very high ceiling, very extremely high. So it's the Pan Green complained that this is a law that is going to make referendum impossible, except that it has something called Article 17. Article 17 says when the country is threatened externally and the sovereignty is likely to be undermined, then the president, with the endorsement of the cabinet, may propose a referendum. This is what Chen Shui-bian, in a situation where there is no other choice, seized upon to try to do something. I do agree, and I'm here billed as a Pan Green person, but I don't belong to DPP. Okay, let's make that straight. I am not a party person. I'm a simple academic. But the Article 17 was truly used by Chen Shui-bian partly for electoral advantage. I don't want to deny that. I think it's foolish for me to deny that. I think that's part of the picture. But it's more than that. It's also a process where the people of Taiwan says we have to have something called referendum in a situation, cohabitation, where something needs to be done to overcome the deadlock. Okay, that's the background of it. And you have, therefore, a situation where, unfortunately, it landed on Article 17. Now, Article 17 is challenged by the Pan Blue, and that challenge went to Beijing, and it came through Beijing to Washington and other places. That's how it developed, you see. So is referendum nothing to do with democracy? Of course it has something to do with democracy. Is it something to do with independence? Of course it has something to do with independence. It can be used for that. Whether it's actually used for that or not, it can be used. That alone is alarming to Beijing, and we have to accept that. Why is DPP not offering herself as an example or try to convince China that it too can move to democracy? Is that concern? Well, now, that's a very complicated question. If you ask Annette Lu that question, Annette Lu would say, oh, yes, of course, we would welcome China becoming democratized, but that's none of our business. After all, we cannot interfere in the affairs of another country, she would say. That's what she would say. If you ask me, I wouldn't say that. I would say it's very good if we could somehow work together and move these Asian countries, particularly China, toward democracy. I would favor that. I think the American engagement policy has behind it the notion of peaceful change of China, making China more responsible and accountable to the world. Yes, I favor all of that. And if Taiwan can become an example, why not? But all the evidence I've seen of development inside China says they resist it up to this point. That's too long a story. I don't want to take time for that. Let me talk about Nixon. I responded too quickly to Professor Goldstein. But evidence indicates that, indeed, Kissinger did sell Taiwan in 1971. I kid you not. If you are not convinced, you go check the evidence yourself. He did not come out telling us the truth. He told us the opposite of what he did in 1971, 72, and a number of years after that. It's easy if you're selling, if it's the United States selling Taiwan, but what can DPP sell? And if you don't sell, how are you going to be convincing? I think there's Kissinger and Nixon could accomplish what they did because there are a number of elements. The common enemy that is Soviet Union, for instance. Do you have that? You have to have that first before you can draw the two parties together to collude on something. Isn't that right? We don't have that, do we? Anyway, there are many elements concerned, and to speak of DPP becoming a Nixon to China, I think is wishful thinking without foundation unless you detail the conditions that would be conducive to it. For me, I don't see that. As to the Sankei Shimbun question, Japan's influence. Yes, Japan is always taken in Taiwan as friend and important in the U.S.-Japan defense mechanism, which includes the protection of Taiwan. And Taiwan has always tried its best to cultivate friends in Japan. Lee Teng-hui, in particular, has tremendous circle of friends that are continuously supportive, and Taiwan wants that. And so when Mori came, this time after he went to mainland and warned Taiwan about referendum, it's taken very seriously. And other efforts were then dispensed to try to explain things to Japan, although that too was somewhat frustrating. Shall I simply, without more time available, simply say that Taiwan takes the relationship with Japan most seriously, next only to the United States, and is continuously going to be doing its best to cultivate this relationship. Thank you.
Any other final word from the other three speakers? Time is up. I'm sorry for that. Time is up, so we have to close the thing down. Sorry. Yeah.
时间飞得那么快，也许很严格的一个主席，对不对？
I'm long-winded, I'm sorry.
No, that's very important stuff. Oh yeah, very important stuff. Yeah.
But I think I'm more.
You're more optimistic.
谢谢。
Your concern. We have to get you out. Are you going for?
Well, that's the key issue. I mean,